frog bugs. Yeah.
People write bugs in little 3x5 cards.
Dude,
all right, well, thanks for coming by. It's 2 o'clock, so I guess we'll get started.
Oh, yeah.
So this isn't really supposed to be EverQuest 2 oriented, but Josh pointed out that my slide format is all EQ2. But it just so happens we all have EQ2 experience, although Josh is on Clone Wars.
Why don't you let us introduce ourselves?
We're going to do that. We're going to do that. So anyway, thanks for coming. How many of you guys are interested in programming, or and who's just here just to find out what we do behind the scenes? Cool. Cool, that's good. So anyway, we're all gamers, geeks, programmers, not public speakers, so thanks for bearing with us while we talk a little bit about what we do day to day. So yeah, we'll go ahead and introduce ourselves. I'm Spence. I'm currently the lead programmer on EQ2. Rothgar on the forums, and I've been with SOE for about 5 years now. Actually, this is my first stint in the gaming industry. I've been programming for a long time, ever since I was a really little kid. It was always an interest of mine. But SOE is my first job in the industry. Before that, I was doing consulting and business programming, and actually met the dev team at the Fan Faire in Atlanta. I guess it was just over 5 years ago. And that was sort of how I got my foot in the door. It was really cool. Got to being a programmer then. They did the dev brunch back then, and so I went to that and got to pick everybody's brain. And I was like a sponge. I wanted to know everything and tell me how everything works. And I just loved talking about that sort of thing with the guys. And got to be friends with one of the guys on the team. And when a spot opened up, he was like, "Hey, if you're interested, put in your application." So I did that, and a few months later, my wife and I were moving out to San Diego to join the team, and ever since then I've been with EQ2 and absolutely love it. It's a dream job for sure. So yeah, why don't you guys introduce yourselves?
My name is Nandy Szots. I'm Zoltaroth on the forums. I'm a senior programmer on EverQuest 2.
Oh, why don't you say how you...
Yeah, tell us a little bit about how you got into this.
Give your resume.
All right, let me go get my resume. Actually, SOE and EQ2 is also the first game that I worked on. Before working at SOE, I worked at General Atomics on DoD projects. Sorry, what?
We'll wait till you're done.
Sorry, you weren't talking to me. I basically got into the game industry because at one point someone posted on the forum saying that they were looking for resumes for programmers, and I sent in my resume to the senior producer at the time and came in for an interview and got hired. And that was about 6 months before Greg came on the team. So we've been actually working together for the last 5 or 6 years now. That's pretty much it. His will take a lot longer.
A little bit. So my name is Alex Irath. I've been making games for about 20 years now or so. I got my start. Well, first I had an ambition when I was 12 years old and living in Germany to immigrate to the States and become a video game programmer. I wanted to go to Silicon Valley, well, San Diego, actually better than Silicon Valley. So, and then I guess it was in 1991, there was an ad for a video game programming position at Park Place Productions back then. And I kept bugging those guys for like 2 weeks with my PC demos and YouTube, and they really liked it, but they didn't have the position, had other candidates. And so they ended up hiring someone else, and they're like, "Oh yeah, but there's this other guy, he's got this little company called Night Technologies," and that was actually John Spence's first company. And so he's actually the guy that got me to start in the industry, basically, in '91. And ever since, I've been with him and Park Place Productions, Sony ImageSoft. Then I was on my own for like 3.5 years, worked with a bunch of different companies doing stuff. And after 3.5 years of doing my own company, I can probably highly suggest everyone should try it once in their life to do your own company, because you'll appreciate it so much more to be an employee somewhere else after that. It's not easy. And so yeah, I was like, I'm ready to be hired, and worked at Radical Entertainment for 1 year up in the Bay Area. Hated it. Get me back down to San Diego. And then I was hired at Angel Studios to do Resident Evil 2 for the N64. With the exception of this project, was probably the most fun project I ever worked on. It was really cool. And then Angel Studios became Rothgar, and I worked on a bunch of titles there. And then I went to THQ for a couple of years in Carlsbad, which was Incinerator Studios at the time, and they kind of didn't talk about having your own company, and they didn't do so well, so they dwindled to just a few employees, and it got a little too risky for me, so I left. Been there, done that, and yeah, I'm here. And I started here in October last year. I mainly work on graphics rendering stuff, but also some other loose ends here and there. I've pretty much, on the game, worked on any aspect of the game, but I've kind of focused on graphics. So I'll probably get some love-hate from you guys. Love for the good things and hate for the things that don't look so good. But I'm hoping to straighten it all out. So bear with me, it's gonna take a while probably to get everything sorted out, but hopefully it's shown a little bit since I started. We'll make it look better, don't worry.
So how many shaders do we have, Alex?
Too many. Exactly, good answer. Too many.
Several thousand. My name is Josh Kriegshauser. I'm known as Autenil on the forums. I got my start in the game industry a long time ago working on a game called Ultima Online. I actually got into that game, or into the game industry by hacking that game. So my story's kind of interesting. I was playing Ultima Online, and I had since the game launched. And they had just released an expansion, and that expansion broke pretty much everything. And they were disconnecting people who were playing the game because they were sending so much data from the server to the client. And having been a hacker, I had looked at the network traffic and knew exactly what the problem was. And about the same time, the company that I worked for, which was actually a credit card processing company, they sent me on a business trip to the same city where Origin Systems, who made Ultima Online, was located. And so I called up their HR department and said, hey, I'm going to be in town on my own dime. Do you want to, does the dev team want to interview me? I'd already put in the resume and everything. And they said, sure. So they grilled me for 3 hours. And at the end of it, I said, look, if you hire me, I'll fix the problem in 2 weeks. And they hired me. I moved down there, and it actually was a one-line code change to fix it.
Nice.
But, so I did that for about 1.5 years. Origin Systems shut down.
How long did it take you to find it?
It took less than a week to find it. To get all set up so I could build the game, run it on my own server and everything, which was a giant mess, by the way. And yeah, so it took less than a week to actually find the problem and fix it, which was a one-line code change. After that, I worked on Ultima Online for about 6 months, and then Origin shut down. Moved to Electronic Arts and continued working on Ultima Online for a little over a year, at which point I started looking around for other places to work. And Sony Online was hiring for EverQuest 2 server engineer, and I jumped right on that. And ended up moving down to San Diego in mid-2005, and I've been with Sony ever since. In late 2009, I transitioned off of the EverQuest 2 team to make Clone Wars Adventures. I got in at the ground level on that. It had been the first time that I actually worked on a brand new game, so I wanted to give that a shot. I still do contribute and have contributed to every expansion on EverQuest 2, even after I've gone on to work on Clone Wars Adventures. So EverQuest 2 is still very much a big part of what I work on. And I'm glad that Greg asked me to sit in on this panel today.
Yeah, we appreciate everything you have done. How many of you guys play EQ2, by the way? Okay, a lot. Do you guys like the flyers and the leapers and the glider mounts that have come out? There's the guy that's responsible for that. John, just stand up real quick. John's also on our coding team. John's been with us for probably about 5 years as well. Started as an intern actually at SOE and just did awesome from day one. So now he's one of our hardcore engineers. So, all right, we'll talk about a little bit about our environment and what we do on a daily basis. So, we'll give you a little bit of stats about EverQuest 2. It's a pretty big project. It's been going on for quite a long time. 12 years in development, way before I started with the company, but it's been in development for a long time. A lot of people have touched it. About 250 plus man years of development time went into EverQuest 2 before it even launched. And I don't know how many since then, but more. A lot more. We have about 400 physical zones in the game and 800 virtual zones. That means, we reuse some of the zone art with different populations. So it's quite a large area in terms of geography. Over 500,000 art and sound assets, and total about 716,000 data files. And by this we just mean anything in the game is represented by some sort of data file, characters and zones and that sort of thing. So to break it down a little bit, we have 65,305 characters and or NPCs, and over 160,000 items in the game. About 11,408 quests. Now you might be looking at that going, there's not that many quests in the game. Some quests are hidden, some happen behind the scenes, they never show up in your journal, that some are used for tracking and that sort of thing. So it's not physical, visible quests that you might see, but there are quite a lot there. And the achievement system is fairly new, but we already have over 1,500 achievements that you can earn in the game. And about 583 collections, all those little shinies that you run around picking up while your group wipes. Oh yeah, it was funny. I was hanging out in the lounge the other day, and my wife, who's in there, she's the EQ2 community manager, was talking to a couple of players in there, and they were talking about collections or something like that. And I happened to be standing there. And she goes, "Hey Greg, do you know how many collections are in the game?" I said, "Yes, 583. And she looked at me like I was making it up. I was like, "No, that's the real answer. I just made this slide. I really do have 583. So I must have looked pretty awesome for knowing that number. So some code statistics about EQ2. EQ2 is made up of over 80 different projects. Projects are anywhere from the rendering engine to XML parsers. Anything that the game has to do code-wise is broken up into individual projects. So we have 80 different projects that make up the entire code base. Over 2 million lines of just game code, and that's just EQ2 specific game code. Tools and utilities, we have almost 1 million lines of code. And now we use a tool called Incredibuild to build, and if we build the entire project, it only takes about 3 minutes and 51 seconds. Josh provided this data, so who knows how accurate it is. But it builds pretty fast. Incredibuild is an awesome tool. We'll tell you a little bit about that. If we didn't have Incredibuild, we haven't tried building the entire project without it, but I'm guessing something like 4 to 6 hours to build the whole thing. I don't know. It would take forever. So, tools. Our main tool that we use is Microsoft Visual Studio. We edit everything from within that tool, whether it's C++ or C#. All the game code's there, and we manage all of our tools and utilities from Visual Studio. So suffice it to say, we couldn't really get by without that tool. It's pretty important. So some of the tools that we write for our team to use that we manage outside of the game. The first one is called Placer. And this basically shares a lot of the code from the game client. The rendering engine and that sort of thing is all used here. And this is what the designers and artists use to populate the game world. And there's some other tools they use in addition to this, but this allows them to go in, move around the zone, decide where things are going to spawn, place widgets, DPOs, which are designer placed objects, and basically lay out the zone from here. And this tool is written in C++, and we maintain that. We also write another tool called Composer, and this tool is used to basically build characters in the game. Characters have different states that they play, which basically is their animation. And you can apply particle effects and sound files to go with those states. So Composer is the tool that they use to hook all of those up and decide how these characters are going to act. And UI Builder is another tool that is written in C++. And this is, you may have seen this if you've tinkered with the UI at all, because we actually ship this down with the game. But this allows us to build all the UI screens in the game. One of my favorite tools, because I like doing UI work. But this is also showing the new ratings screen that's coming out soon. And if you, like I said, we ship this down, so if you're interested in modding the game or playing with UI, you can actually use this tool. If you look in the EQ2 directory, there'll be a zip file called uibuilder.zip, and you can unpack it and load the UI and mess with it. So in addition to C++, we also do a lot of coding in C#. C# is a .NET managed language. It's a little bit easier to drag and drop controls on forms, and you work very visually, and so you can really prototype applications very quickly. So a lot of the tools that we use that aren't reliant on C++ code, like our rendering engine, we will do in C# because we can do it very fast. So some of the tools that we maintain in C#, one of them is called Sequence, and our designers use this a lot. It's really just a glorified XML editor, but it allows them to edit all of the designer files. Those 700,000 files I was talking about earlier can all be edited from within Sequence. And this just basically breaks the fields down into something more usable. So characters are created in this, quests, all the game data is built in here. They all have their own custom forms and custom controls for doing things like selecting colors if you're tinting objects and that sort of thing. So this tool definitely could have improvements made to it, but it's pretty handy, and I would say designers are in this every day. So we try to keep this up to date as much as possible. Designer Dashboard is a fairly new tool. It's actually one of the first projects I worked on when I joined the company. The tool I was showing you earlier, Placer, primarily was used before Designer Dashboard for determining how things would spawn in the game. You'd load it up in Placer, you'd place the points, then you'd load all of your local game servers to see how everything looked. If you wanted to make a change, you'd have to shut down your servers, go into Placer, move things around, and start it back up. So that was pretty tedious. So we wanted to come up with a way where you could have more control over populating your zone from right within the client. So that's what Designer Dashboard was created to do. It works very similar to how you would decorate your house in EQ2. You would tell it you want to place an orc over here, and it puts the orc on your cursor, and you can rotate it and set it exactly where you want, and then it stores that spawn point in the data file. So it's very visual, it's easy to tweak things and move things around. So this is used quite a bit for populating new zones. And last but not least, we also do a lot of work on web-based tools and reports using ASP.NET and Perl. And I'll let Nandy talk about that a little bit, because that's sort of his area of expertise.
This is a small list of all my Perl scripts. It's actually not all of them. We have a lot of back-end stuff that we do directly in the database that can't be done either through in-game interfaces or web interfaces. So these Perl scripts pretty much do everything from finding items to, well, let's see, what do we do? We can find duped items, duped heritage quests, everything. All the reporting stuff that runs through EQ2 usually uses Perl scripts to scrape through all of the logs. We generate probably somewhere on the order of 20 gigs of logs per day, probably per server. So we log everything, and we have a lot of automated scripts that can go through and find anomalies in those logs and then email out reports about them. All these Perl scripts also handle all of the back end of the spam filtering system, which you guys have probably used a little bit in the game. So it will pull out all of the reported spam, run some logic against it, and figure out what stuff needs to be added to the database and what stuff doesn't, and stuff like that.
Some other good examples are, You know, anytime we need one-off type of stuff, like if we've discovered an exploit in the game or something like that, of course that rarely happens, right? But if something like that happens and we need to find out, you know, who was responsible or who was taking advantage of that, then that's normally a one-off thing, and Nandy can write up a script that will scrape those logs and find that for our customer service department. So it's really important that you know, we be able to have this kind of utility capability.
Yeah, probably the last important thing that we do with this, a lot of times when we give away free items for different events or things like that, some people will say, hey, I haven't gotten my item yet, but my buddy has. It's probably because one of these scripts is still running and hasn't gotten to your character in the list yet. So a lot of that stuff is done by manipulating the database directly, because it's such a high volume of data. There's really not a better way to do that.
Another great use of Perl that we use is those 700,000 designer data files. They're all XML. If we need to make a mass change for some reason, like if we're doing some kind of item revamp and we're changing a bunch of stats around or something like that, we usually write a Perl script that will rip through and find all of the cases that need to be changed. It's a lot easier to do that than to put a designer on it and have them try and, you know, look through 10,000 items or whatever it is, 100,000.
65,300.
Yeah. Right. So it'll look through all of those files much faster than a human can and make the appropriate changes.
Yeah, that was one of the things that actually was one of the scripts on here is like the script that we use to convert all the items to heirloom items. So that was actually just done by a script that went through, looked at every single item, used some logic to determine whether or not it should become heirloom, and then put an heirloom tag on it. And I think at that time we checked out something like, I'm trying to remember, like 18,000 files, and then checked them back in. So you can imagine QAing, my QA note says, spawn 18,000 items and make sure they all look correct and have all the correct tags on them. A lot of that stuff takes a long time to test. So.
Did they throw things at you afterwards?
I'm sorry, what?
Did they throw things at you afterwards?
Yeah, sometimes.
Yeah.
I'm sure they say plenty of things that we couldn't repeat here.
Yeah.
And more importantly, all these Perl scripts, Nandy forgot to mention that they are job security for him, because nobody would want to touch them after he was gone. So back to IncrediBuild I mentioned earlier. This is basically a tool that allows us to build a project pretty quickly. Josh, what are you talking about?
All right, IncrediBuild. This screenshot that we found here is actually not from any SOE builds. It's just a screenshot that we pulled down off the interwebs. You can see, like along the left-hand side there's a list of machine names. So everybody's machine on their desk is connected into our IncrediBuild network. When one person, say Greg, wants to do a build, he just starts IncrediBuild, and it will actually distribute tasks to Nandy's machine, Alex's machine, my machine, every other machine in the Office network. And everybody's machine will be working for Greg's machine at that point. And by distributing those tasks out, what could be 4 hours to do a full build on one machine, gets down to 3 minutes. So it's a very, very useful tool, and one of our most important tools for time saving.
Yeah, I can't imagine what it'd be like. There'd be a lot of waiting for things to get done, or building them when you go home for the night and coming back and hoping everything was okay.
It's actually kind of unfortunate that it doesn't work from home. A lot of times, we go home and we keep working sometimes, and IncrediBuild is not fast enough over the VPN to actually distribute tasks. So if you go home and build on your machine at home, it takes a lot longer. It takes probably 45 minutes just to build the client alone. So IncrediBuild is really an incredible tool.
All right, so IncrediBuild started with some of the, these are tools that we don't actually write ourselves. They're third-party tools that we do make a lot of use of. Actually, SOEmon was written by SOE, just not by game team, by our platform department. And this is kind of a dashboard that we use for maintaining our live games. If you've ever gone up to SOE and toured the facilities and they take you by the operations department, you'll see a bunch of guys sitting back there with projectors showing these images all over the walls. And with this tool, they can monitor server health. They can see how many players are concurrently on each server. They can look at frame time, so how fast servers are able to process information. So there's all kinds of stuff here that we can see. Like on the left is a server list, and the ones in red indicate a down world. In this case, these aren't worlds that are actually up anymore, so it's not a problem. But we would be looking for that, and if we see a world go down, then we know we can respond to that pretty quickly. So Ops is watching that stuff 24 hours a day, and if something goes wrong, they will call somebody from one of the dev teams, and we'll have to take a look at it. So SOE is normally one of the first tools that we look at to determine is it up or down, is it locked, what are the frame rates, are there any clients currently logged in. Sometimes there's zone problems, like a certain zone won't come up, and we can look at individual zones here and find out if they're hung and exactly what machines they're running on, so then we can get onto that physical box and see what's going on with it. So this is a really helpful tool. And pretty much all of us have this running on one of our machines every day, and we just keep an eye on it. So also Recap is another tool that was developed at SOE, and a lot of the games use it now. And what Recap does is, if you've ever had a client crash, which again I know is something that rarely ever happens to any of you guys, but in the rare occurrence that it does, the game client will generate a crash log, and the next time you connect to one of our servers, it'll upload that and put it into Recap. And this is something that Alex integrated for EQ2 recently. Prior to this, it was very manual. We'd have to go through and find that crash file where it was located on the box and dig through it manually. And Recap is really cool because it every time we build a new version of the game, we upload our PDB files or our code files up to the Recap server. So Recap knows about the code for every single version of the game that we have. So whenever you experience a client crash and that core file gets uploaded to the server, it checks the version of the client that you are running, and it compares that to the back-end code files, and it can already do some of the work for us. It can tell us what function the crash occurred in, what line it occurred on, and it groups all that information up by crash address. So it's really cool. We can go in here and look at the number of crashes in order of frequency. So that's typically what one of us will do. We'll look at this every day or so, and we'll look to see if there are any new crashes that are happening with a lot of frequency. And if so, then we'll dig into that crash and see if we can figure out what's going on with it. So, if you're on the forums and you're saying that you're crashing, we might ask you for some more information about your computer or your IP address, and that's so we can pull up Recap and look at your crash log and figure out what's going on. So this has been really helpful. Since we got this tool, we've actually reduced our crashes by quite a bit. We know there's still a couple out there that need to be tackled, but this has been a tremendous tool to help us get a lot of this taken care of. I think Josh is going to talk a little bit about telemetry. This is a new tool we also got that we got the site-wide license for Sony, so quite a few of our games are starting to integrate this, and this is really awesome, helping us to fight the lag beast. So yeah, that's one of the things we're always fighting with, is trying to increase server performance, and he'll tell you a little bit about telemetry and how that works.
Telemetry is a third-party tool made by Rad Game Tools. Rad Game Tools makes a lot of great tools that we use. They make a video library called Bank that we actually have for that intro video. Their sound library Miles is what pretty much all SOE games use for their sound rendering. And then they also have a tool called Granny, which is an animation library that, again, most SOE games also use. So we built a great rapport with Rad Game Tools. So when new tools come out that they want game companies to try, they seek out companies like SOE. So Frank Black over at Rad Game Tools contacted me and asked me if I'd like to evaluate this new telemetry software, which is a profiling tool. Telemetry allows us to look at a sliver of the game's running performance. So we can play the game, we can run through, and we might notice some lag spikes or something like that. We can then go back and look at the telemetry dump and figure out what exactly happened during that lag spike. And that is invaluable at trying to figure out what's causing lag. Go back to the other page real quick. There's, on the left-hand side there, you can see there's a list of a bunch of different captures. So we could actually set it up such that the entire team is playtesting with telemetry turned on. One server is gathering all of their information. So at the end of a playtest or something, then one programmer or several programmers can connect to the telemetry server and look at, if Nandy reports a problem saying that he got a lag spike when doing this, we could pull up his telemetry report and look at specifically what's going on. So on this slide, you're kind of getting a cross view of the clients running. On this graph, from left to right is time, right? So over the left, it's like when the client is first started, and over the right is as it progresses on a few frames later. From bottom to top is a measurement of frame time. So the taller numbers are longer frames. If we could look at the taller spikes there and drill down on those frames and see exactly what's going on to make that frame so long. The pink overlay there is additional information that we can report. In this case, it's actually tracking, this is a server function here. So this is tracking like script updates, scheduler updates, NPCs moving around and stuff like that. And that pink line shows a spike where we spent a lot more time than we should have probably doing NPC updates, for instance. Go ahead and hit the next frame.
Yeah, in that particular case, you can see that the frame time is actually pretty short, but there's a spike in mudlib. The plot points let us plot any kind of data we want. Sometimes you're looking for problems where maybe we sent too much data down to the client and it doesn't result in a long frame, but we can look for those problems with these plot points. They look pretty cool.
So if we double click on one of those tall stacks on the last page, it gives us kind of a view like this. This is actually drilling down further, and you can see from left to right, that's one whole frame in time. Execution proceeds from left to right, so it shows function calls, and the depth is as functions call other functions, they go further down that list there. And as they return, it goes back up. So if you were to follow kind of the line of the bottom there, you would see how the code is executing. So you look for longer bars, and those bars indicate that function is taking a large amount of time. I can't see the screen there, but I believe this is one particular frame where on the left-hand side we're doing UI updates, and on the right-hand side we're actually doing rendering. Typically, during this is a client frame now. Typically, doing in the client, rendering takes the most amount of time. That's drawing everything that you see on the screen: the terrain, the trees, the creatures, everything like that. Updating the UI, which is the user interface, the windows that you click on and stuff like that, really shouldn't take that long. So this gives us a good example of something where we should probably look into what exactly is going on and why it's taking so long. The next frame is like if you double click on one of those longer bars, it gives us a view like this. And we can see that it's actually doing the achievements window, it's redrawing it's recalculating all of the little achievement icons and where they should go on the page. This is probably something that we could definitely speed up. It really only happens when resizing a window. So, we kind of have to prioritize things based on how often they happen, to whom they happen, so on and so forth. But you can see that this tool gives us a very visual representation of how things are running inside the game. Prior to this, we really just had log files to go through, and it can be tedious to dig through all of that stuff. Seeing it visually is really what sold us on this tool, and we actually ended up getting it for the entire San Diego campus.
Yeah, and we really just, for EverQuest 2, just rolled support out for this with Game Update 60, so we haven't had a lot of time yet to start digging into it, but hopefully that's something we can work in soon. I mean, as you've seen, we've got a pretty aggressive schedule through November, but I really want to get some time for us to start digging through situations. A good example would be having one of us log in from work and go to a public quest and run telemetry on our client while a public quest is happening, and we could capture all that information and figure out exactly what's happening in the client that's causing the lag, or on the server side, depending on what it is we're trying to look at. So,
Greg brings up an interesting point. We actually use this tool for both the client and the server. Now, the client runs on Windows. That runs on all of your machines. The servers actually run on our Linux backend. So it's a completely different operating system. When we first looked at this tool, it didn't support Linux. But since we have such a good rapport with the guys over at Rad Game Tools, you know, we just shot them we just shot them an email asking if that would be something that they would consider adding. And like the next drop that we got, it had Linux support in it. So that was pretty awesome, actually.
yeah, they're really responsive. So that's kind of it for our presentation. We flew through stuff really quick. Obviously, we could talk a lot more about different aspects of what we do, but I wanted to make sure you guys had enough time to ask questions. We've got about 25 minutes left. So if you guys want to ask questions either related to programming or anything specific about any of the games, maybe if you have questions about any particular problems we've experienced in the past and how we've solved them, anything you guys want to ask, we're good for. If you'd like, just go ahead and step up to the mic. It should be on, then everybody can hear you.
Okay, I always like to hear the relationships between database servers, the zone servers, how they talk to each other, etc.
You want to tackle that, Nandy?
Very carefully. I guess it's a pretty involved question. Let me try to answer it in a way that'll be fairly straightforward. The way our servers are set up is we have 3 server processes, main server processes that run. We have a world server, a login server, and essentially a zone server. Zone servers are multiples. World servers are obviously one per world, and there's multiple login servers that people go through to log in. There's also another service called the World Manager that can spin up dynamic zones on demand. So basically, the general layout is there's a login server, world servers connect to the login server, and zone servers connect to their own world server. And these are spread across data centers, spread across multiple machines. Any particular world is running on anywhere from 10 to 32 Unix boxes.
Now, your question also dealt with the database a little bit. Do you mind if I...
No.
So the database side, the world server is responsible for communicating with the database and making sure that everything that gets updated on the zones actually gets saved out to the database. The world server is prepared to deal with things like if database threads get stuck, updating a transaction, we actually have to work very closely with our database operations team to make sure that the databases are performing optimally, that we're not locking more data than we should be, so on and so forth. The Forge Light engine that you may have heard talked about a little bit at the welcome ceremony, that is the basis for Free Realms, Clone Wars, and eventually EQNext and PlanetSide 2. We actually changed that paradigm a little bit. With the Forge Light engine, we actually have a database cache server and a database cluster server. So those 2 independent servers are very generic, and they know nothing about the game logic. They just know how to effectively talk to a database. But they, as the name would imply, database cache server, they actually store data so we don't have to hit the database as often. This is actually one thing that has been a subject of much optimization on EQ2 as we look for more ways to avoid talking to the database except when absolutely necessary. So with ForgeLight, that's one of the major improvements that we made for communicating with the database.
So, as an old MUD programmer, there's a striking resemblance to a lot of things in the game to LP MUDs. And I'm wondering how big a role LP MUDs played in the development of the core game.
That would be a great question for people that were here like 12 years ago.
I know someone that can answer that question really well, but he's not here. Yeah, so I'm sure it was probably a big part of it, especially with EQ1, because EQ1 kind of followed that whole RPG MUD genre, and I think the idea was slap a 3D interface on it and put you in the world. So I'm sure that was a big influence for them, but most of us weren't here around that time.
Maintainability and expandability of the project have to be core to pretty much the entire design. How do you manage that, especially with the rendering engine, given the hundreds of graphics configurations that exist in the Windows world right now?
Yeah, it's tough.
The maintainability is especially in MMOs, is one of the core facets that we try and pursue in our programming. Alex can and should talk about the rendering engine as it kind of lives apart from like the server backend. But on EQ2, we actually did, or the original developers and us as we maintained it, did a great job of setting things up in such a way that it was very easy to add on new features and very rare that we would break old features. That hasn't been true of every game that I've worked on. But in EQ2, I think it actually was set up very well with maintainability kind of being at its core. You want to talk about the renderer?
Sure. So one thing where the rendering engine is different than most other areas of code is that you're always dealing with, well, nowadays with shaders, which is basically another piece of code that runs on your graphics card. And what a shader is kind of a gray area. It goes from, at the very least, it's some kind of code that runs on your graphics card, but then there's also render states and other things that go into what one would call a shader. And so anytime you want to make any kind of fundamental changes to how the shaders work, you would then have to go back and either change all the shaders that have already been created, or you just say you support both the older and the newer shaders. And so as far as, and that's also why you guys see some of the problems. They're just not easy to find. Sometimes an artist creates a shader using a shader tool to create shaders, and sometimes the tool just doesn't work right, or there's a problem, or some file didn't get checked in or something. And then trying to go through every single new shader that's being created is obviously very time-consuming. And that's where you guys come in. So yeah, please report all the problems that we have. I go through the forums every now and again, and I get some really good feedback with people posting shots of that. Usually it's shader 3 stuff. I'm also fighting the fire from our end by giving the artists better shader 3 support so they can verify their art and course on shader 3 platforms. But yeah, as far as maintainability, very, very difficult.
This is related to, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, when you were giving the example about the BQs, I know y'all said y'all could do it like on your local client, right? Can you use that same, as something's running on a live server, to use that, maybe have an archive or something, y'all can go and when someone puts in a complaint about the lag on us, like say for instance the Stormlord's PQ, could y'all go back in through the system and check it out and find out exactly what happened then, or is it just something that you have a limited amount of time? You pretty much have to be watching it in order to.
Yeah, unfortunately, we have to turn it on and monitor it because it's an extreme amount of data. As you saw from this screenshot here, for one single server frame, each one of these bars is called a zone, which is when a function starts and ends. So for a single server frame, I think there's something, like, you can see in this zoomed in how many there are at the bottom. I think there's like 500 or 600 zones in one frame. So the server has to capture that information and send it over the network to the tool that's capturing it. So it's an extreme amount of bandwidth required to keep this going. I'm sure if we turned it on, you guys would all of a sudden notice things are running slower than normal. So we definitely wouldn't want to run it all the time. And then you can imagine we'd have to run it in every zone to be able to go back and have that data available. So it's just not really feasible that we do it that way. But so that makes it a little bit hard to
So at this point, they don't have it to the point where it can run passive, right?
say that again.
At this point, they don't have it to where it can run passive.
It is passive, but because, I mean, it goes back to you can't test something without changing it, right? So the same is true in computer science as well. When we put telemetry on a client, it does run slightly slower, right? But we still get a good relative picture of how the game is performing, and when we do have lag spikes, we can find them. Now, that's not to say that telemetry is the only tool in our arsenal to fight lag. The servers actually have logging for long frames. So if a server frame, which is basically an update cycle, right. if it takes longer than expected, we actually log that out to the local disk on the server, which is a very fast operation, right? And we can include certain. We can't include this level of detail, but we do include certain timings, where we can narrow it down to script operations took too long, or updating network traffic took too long. So that's not to say that this is our only tool. We do actually have other ways where we can go back a limited amount of time and look for these long frame reports and try and figure out what's going on.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Kind of a weird question.
We take those.
It's based on a bug I've been seeing recently. I mentioned it earlier in another panel about the COD issues. When a character dies, what actually happens on the back end? Because it seems like it sets a flag, right? But then in some cases that flag isn't getting cleared. And I'm just kind of curious what else is going on there.
Yeah, that's an odd one. I remember us talking about that before. Basically, the problem he was saying was that with the call of the veteran, sometimes when you use it, it'll tell you it can't work because one of you is dead. Either the one you're trying to summon or the one you're trying to teleport to is dead. So I was thinking about how that could be possible, and I can't really think of how that would happen just off the top of my head, because the state of being dead is really you have a flag on your character that says you're dead, and you're playing a specific animation state, which is that you're lying on the ground. And so, as you can imagine, all throughout the code, when things are happening, we're checking, are you dead or not? And that's just checking, a simple flag. So, the call to the veteran object is using the same function call to see if you're dead as everything else in the game, like whether or not you can move, whether you can cast a spell, all those things check to see if you're alive or not. And so it's curious that call of veteran would fail where all the other function checking around being dead or not is working just fine. So it makes me think that the problem is somewhere within that call of veteran code. So we just have to look at it and see.
Or maybe it's even not right, it's throwing the wrong error possibly.
Yeah, it could be something like that. It could be, who knows. It's one of those odd things that hopefully we can reproduce it on our end so that we can figure out what's going on and fix it. It's probably one of those things that takes us, 8 hours to find the problem and about 5 seconds to fix it. those are a lot of the issues that we come across.
Folks have talked about the server hardware upgrade. Can you share with us any details of what we got, why it helped, and how we're going to take advantage of it?
Yeah, a little bit. So most of the server hardware, so as Nandy was explaining the way the server setup works, we have a number of entity servers that run individual zones. And a single piece of server hardware can run multiple zone processes. And obviously, the more you start to run on a box, the less time the box can give to each of those processes. And so a lot of the server hardware was running on the same stuff we launched with. And those machines were, high-end Intel Xeon processors with high clock speeds, but they were, equivalent to like dual-core machines, basically. So as time goes on and we release more and more zones into the game, we're requiring that the whole server pool do more work. And it just shortens those time slices that each zone can have. So the new hardware, I think they're something like dual 6-core machines. So they've basically got 24 processors, hyper-threaded, can run, 12 processors, hyper-threaded, can run 24 concurrent processors without splitting the time. So these new machines can easily run 8 to 10 times more than what the old ones are doing. We're actually able to cut our number of boxes down that we use for a single server cluster. A typical cluster with the old hardware would run 32 dedicated nodes with also access to a shared pool of nodes. The new hardware, we're able to get by using just 10 machines and still have way more overhead for growth than what we had with the old ones. So that's good for us too, because it's less hardware, less chance that something would break, and less power requirements and rack space in our data centers. So it's good all around for us to do these upgrades. It just takes time, as you can imagine. It's a lot of servers out there, and it still was a big budget hit for us to make that change. But we're really happy that we're rolling that stuff out now. It should really help. Hope did that answer everything?
So you talked a minute ago about caching data. So you don't hit the database as much. I'm assuming you're caching data, you look up rank variety. You're not caching actual updates to the database. This is an assumption on my part. Caching the updates would be tricky.
Yeah, Nandy's just worked on that recently.
Yeah, what we are currently caching in the database level is a few months ago we made some changes where we made the entire zoning process not take any database transactions. It's purely based in memory now, so that sped up zoning quite a bit when we implemented that, because before you would go to the database every time you zone and load in all your character data as if you were logging in for the first time. It was really inefficient.
Yeah, and you might remember that there were some problems back then. If we were having DB issues, you'd get stuck zoning, and that problem should have gone away now because of that change.
Yeah, I don't know if any of you guys play on Freeport, but I was on Freeport fairly extensively trying to debug the problem a couple months ago, where people were getting stuck with receiving zone info because their characters just took forever to load from the database. So those were some of the changes we made at the time. That really helped. I think the other part of your question is whether or not we cache database updates. The answer is yes and no. We don't really cache them, but they do go into a queue. We have a pool of connections to the database server, and it gets thrown into the most underworked queue at the time, and that's processing stuff as it's getting through it. So that's why sometimes when the world crashes, you guys say that we did a server rollback. We didn't really do a server rollback. It's just some of the changes hadn't gotten committed, but they typically get committed pretty quickly unless something really bad is going on.
Nandy, how big is the biggest character that you've seen in terms of size of data?
Character transfer system is now starting to hit I think the 5 or 8 meg limit we have on sending network packets. So,
and that's all compressed data too.
Yeah, that's all compressed character data for one character. Those are pretty big characters.
And we never delete characters unless you guys delete characters, and even then we don't.
We never delete characters. Well, a few exceptions, asterisks.
Right.
We have gone through and done some purges, especially when we did the server merges. But typically, as a rule, we generally don't delete characters. Even if you guys delete a character, we just mark it as gone, but we don't actually purge it from the database.
Next.
I had a question on the multi-cores. It sounded like your server stuff is set up well to expand through multiple cores, but the client side, I know you guys are just now pushing out to the second core on that. How does that work?
Actually, our server code is pretty linear. A single entity server isn't really designed to run multiple threads, other than doing things like accessing resources and there's some third-party utilities like telemetry and stuff like that will run in its own thread. But the entity server is pretty much linear. The reason it works well on the way I described it is because we're running multiple entity servers on a single box. So it scales pretty good. And that entity server doesn't need to run at the same frame rate as a client does. Typical frame rate we're looking for on an entity server is about 10 frames a second. That just means we're doing an entire game update loop 10 times a second. That's enough for it to receive a message from your client, process it, load whatever data it needs, create new packets, send them back out to you. As long as that's happening about 10 times a second, everything's cool. On your game client, you obviously want to be running at 60 frames or more a second if you can, or 30 frames or more a second if you can. So the client's a lot more sensitive to frame rate than the server is. Sometimes the server can get down to 4 frames a second and 4 or 5 frames a second in some RAID zones, and you start to notice a little more lag at that point. But it can just handle slower frame rates better than the client can. As far as multi-core support on the client, Josh has really done the most in that area. If you want to talk about it,
I'm actually going to defer to Alex, as he is or will be the one working on that next.
So yeah, the
Asterisk.
a common method to try and speed up the client for rendering is in decoupling the rendering with the update. So what's currently happening is the game starts its frame and it updates all the characters' positions, and then it figures out what it needs to draw, and then it goes and sends all the data that it needs to draw off to the graphics card. But then the CPU has to wait for the graphics card to finish the drawing before it can continue with the next frame. And so you can actually decouple this in basically you're building your frame on a separate thread on a multi-core machine where the update runs in parallel with basically sending data to the graphics card on another thread. So you're basically going to be one thread behind because you're building the one frame behind, sorry. You're going to be one frame behind in your drawing because you're building the next frame on your current update, but it shouldn't be visible at all to the player. But that way you can make sure that the thread that's feeding the graphics cards, the commands can run independent from the update. And it will just keep spinning and waiting for the graphics card, and while it's waiting for the graphics card, the other thread can continue the update and doesn't have to wait for the graphics to finish. The only thing is at the very end, the update and the rendering thread both have to be synced to one another. So if you get a fast graphics card, then the rendering might be done quicker in the update than the rendering has to wait for the update to finish and vice versa. And that will hopefully be coming. I'm not going to commit because that's actually another thing that I'm working on right now. But it should be coming coming soon.
Oh, come on. Yeah.
All right. Well, that's about it for the time we have. The next panel in here is the EverQuest 2 Mechanics panel. I just want to say thanks again for coming and listening. We're always willing to talk about this kind of stuff, so if you find us in the game lounge or anywhere, feel free to come up and ask us questions. We love talking to you guys, so thanks a lot. We'll take a little bit of a break before Mechanics starts.